you for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about the situation in Iran today and the water. It's a pretty big deal, as in like a huge deal. They're out of water. And how they get out of water? Well, that's a very interesting story. But before I get started, a lot going on in this country with ICE agents evidently shooting women in their cars. You hear a lot of things online. I haven't heard anybody actually talk about the actual facts of the matter other than the emotional. Oh, look, the Republicans are saying they didn't do it on purpose. Oh, look, the Democrats are saying this. Well, as long as people stick with the tribal narrative, you're going to get nothing but BS. So let me explain to you how this happened. And please keep in mind, I am not defending the cops by any means or way, okay? But we do need to stick to the truth here, okay? According to headlines, ICE agents are being roasted by Americans wherever they go. Cops fear for their lives, even with all that ammo. And who jumps in front of a moving vehicle? People think if a cop tells them to exit their vehicle that they have some rights. Not true. The request made was lawful. You hear the cop said, or whoever that thug was, get out of the car. He did not say, well, would you think about leaving the car? He explicitly said, get out of that car. That is an order, not a simple request. And this has all been cleared up by the courts. I'm just going to tell you how it works, not whether I agree with it or not. People get it wrong. They say, well, I didn't consent and I can stay in the car. Well, consent is irrelevant here. This is a command, not a request. Next, people think, well, they need a reason to make me get out. Well, have you seen a cop when you say you're not going to get out? They put their heads through that window and they will yank you physically out. They do not need a reason. The stop itself is sufficient. Then people say, well, I can refuse and argue my rights. Well, even though we're still playing that people have rights, you can argue that later. But what happens on scene? Physical removal in a very brutal way. They will yank your body right out of that car through that window however they can. You will get arrested for obstruction or failure to comply. And use of force under department policy is A-OK. We have all these people online. We have that mean girl, Megan Kelly. Megan Kelly, these are actors, okay? She 100% used to play the role of Nicole Brown Simpson. So mean girl Megan Kelly saying, hey, they had a right to do that. And actually, the mean girl is right. They did have a right to do that. They had an absolute right to do that. This has been ruled by the courts. This is not guesswork. You do not have any rights. When a cop says, get out of that car, well, if you don't get out of the car on your own, they're going to get you out of that car. And then all of your rights, which you think you had, are gone. They will then search that car. They will do a lot of things to that car. And if you're not lucky, they could even seize that car. We have all these things about, cops can seize your money by the road. They can do a lot of things. So you need to get your head around where we are right now. The cops have ruled on all this. You do not have any rights when you're sitting in your car. So you can play smart, you can play glib all you want to these officers, but remember, they're the ones with the weapons in their hands. So do what you need to do, but remember, they are doing this within the laws that they have constructed. If you think you're going to win if you fight them, well, hey, go ahead. Let me know how it turns out. A lot of this is leading to what they're considering the Insurrection Act. Basically, they just want Americans to get so ticked off at the right or the left that everybody breaks out into a civil war. Well, if you look around, all the big people on social media, the ones making millions of dollars for lying to the rest of us, yeah, they're all talking about get out there in the streets as they sit in their $1 million homes. They want everybody out in the streets, and that's why the top people on social media are pushing this civil war. Everybody's so mad. Well, what they want to do is this: everything has a result. They want to trigger the Insurrection Act. It is a U.S. federal law that allows the President of the United States to deploy active duty military forces. or federalize National Guard troops inside the United States to enforce the law or suppress disorder. It is one of the few legal exceptions to the general rule that the U.S. military is not used for domestic policing. If enough things get going, they can call in this Insurrection Act, and that will trigger military force or federalized National Guards on the streets in the USA. That law was passed in 1807. Early U.S. leaders feared internal rebellions, uprising, or states' refusal to enforce federal law. It was designed as a last resort emergency power, not a routine law enforcement tool. And that is what they're trying to trigger. So I'd like to clear up a few facts here. People are always saying, "Oh, those cops, they got such dangerous jobs. Those people they're making the cops, they're going to kill the cops. The cops are the victims. Watch out. The cops are the worst victims in the world." Well, actually, being a police officer is not even close to the most deadliest job in America. The number one deadly job, logging workers, among the deadliest job in America. They risk falling trees, heavy machinery, remote locations, little backup, no immediate medical access. Fatality rate often 5 to 10 times higher than police officers. Commercial fishing, open ocean, extreme weather, long hours. They risk drownings, hypothermia, the vessel capsizing. Deaths are often total crew losses. Historically, one of the top three deadliest occupations. And then, of course, we have the roofers. They risk falls, heat stroke, electrocution. Their death usually is caused by gravity, not other people. No body armor, no weapons, no qualified immunity if you're a roofer. And of course, we have construction laborers and iron workers. They use heavy equipment. They work at extreme heights. They have collapsing structures. Fatal accidents are routine, not exceptional, often working without full safety compliance. Then, number five, the miners, the coal, hard rock, and uranium. They have cave ins, explosions, toxic exposure, long term fatal disease like black lung and cancers. Their deaths are often delayed, but casually direct. And of course, in this number six spot, we have agriculture workers. Machinery could roll over on you, chemical exposure, heat, high fatality, chronic illness rates, frequently undocumented with minimal protections. And then in the number seven spot, we have delivery drivers and transportation workers. Traffic fatalities are a leading cause, more likely to be killed by other drivers than police are by suspects. Includes truckers, garbage collectors, and tow operators. So, where does the police actually rank? Well, police work does involve risk, but most line of duty deaths of cops are traffic accidents, heart attacks, and training incidents. Homicide of officers is statistically rare relative to civilian workplace deaths, civilian homicide risk in many neighborhoods. Police fatality rates are lower than logging, fishing, roofing, mining, construction, agriculture, and transportation. The danger of policing is not uniquely high, but listen to this, but it is uniquely narrated. Other dangerous workers do not carry weapons. They do not control civilians. They do not receive legal immunity. They do not frame routine risk as justification for force. A roofer who falls off the roof is not said to be under threat, does not get to kill someone preemptively, does not receive institutional narrative protection. Many people go to work every single day with a higher chance of dying than a police officer. They go to work without weapons, without authority, and without legal installation. This doesn't mean cops don't face any danger. So, And then you read about all the crime statistics, right? Oh, well, this neighborhood is, according to the FBI data, the most dangerous place on the planet. Well, got a little clue for you here. The FBI crime data, it is actually a voluntary reporting system built from incomplete local inputs filtered through changing definitions. The FBI does not directly collect most crime data. It aggravates what local agencies choose and are able to submit. So, intentional underreporting. There is documented incentive to reduce reported crimes before elections, to improve department images, to maintain funding or federal grants, and to avoid DOJ oversight. So there's a lot of incentive. Missing data is treated as zero, not unknown. Headlines are written as if the data were complete. So that's how you get all these crime reports. Let's talk a little bit about this fear of those Muslims. Those Muslims are going to bride everybody to their deaths. Everybody is so afraid of Muslims. The people in Iran are really getting hit now. Is anybody feeling sorry for them? Well, I would have to say, not really. It's called Islamophobia in the U.S. is racialized, not just religion. So, what does racialized mean? It has been made about race, even if it was not inherently racial to begin with. So, Islamophobia in the U.S. is racialized, is how it is. The word is used. It has been made about race, even if it was not inherently racial to begin with. So that means that race is imposed. People are not racialized by nature, they are racialized by systems. It assigns meaning and hierarchy. Once racialized, a group is often labeled as dangerous, inferior or superior, disposable, irrational, criminal, less deserving of protections. And that's what's gone on between the U.S. and Iran. They are, in fact, racialized. So that in itself justifies differential treatment. Racialization often underpins unequal laws, targeted policing, environmental exposure, labor exploitation, and medical neglect. And it could also apply to places, not just people, neighborhoods, borders, reservations, and entire regions can be racialized and treated as sacrifice zones, experimental spaces, and security threats. So, in practice, hostility towards Muslims, in particular in the U.S., often functions as racial prejudice, not simply religious disagreement. People perceived as Middle Eastern, Arab, South Asian, or North African are frequently targeted regardless of their actual religion. The Sikhs, the Christians, atheists, and Jews have all been attacked or profiled because they were mistakenly assumed to be Muslim. This mirrors older forms of racism where appearance, names, accents, or clothing stand in for the race. So that is why scholars describe U.S. Islamophobia as racialization of religion. So anti Muslim bias did not begin with modern terrorism or geopolitics. It draws from older patterns. Colonial era European narratives, they frame the Muslims as violent, irrational, sexually dangerous, incapable of self rule. Those ideas migrated into U.S. culture through the British imperial ideology, orientation, orientationalist scholarships, missionary and military discourse. Muslims were cast as a civilization threat, not merely a theological one. So, post 9/11, after 2011, prejudice became embedded in law, policy, and institutions, not just social attitudes. And you'll notice the young woman who was murdered by the ICE agent actually is being called a terrorist, and that's kind of alarming to a lot of people. What they don't realize was that after 2011, prejudice became embedded in law, policy, and institutions. We now have surveillance centers all over this country. They're called fusion centers. I've talked a lot about it. And these programs they came up with after 2011 were specifically to target the Muslims. This is how it works, right? They say, well, we got to get those Muslims under control, those dirty Muslims, get them under control. Let's get them under surveillance. And everybody goes, yay, 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 let's get the Muslims. And then they realize, wow, they weren't just quite after all those rasty Muslims, they were after the rest of us. I am a 74-year-old white woman. I am considered a terrorist by the U.S. government. Full stop. How it worked was by going after the Muslims first, right? So that gave them ways to surveil programs targeting Muslim communities, immigration bans framed around Muslim majority countries, airport profiling. You're still taking your shoes off at airports because of those damn Muslims. Counterterrorism doctrines that equate Muslim identity with risk. This converted bias into systematic discrimination, which is a key marker of racism. So Muslims begin treated as suspect class. In U.S. political culture, Muslims are often treated as perpetually foreign, conditionally American, collectively responsible for the actions of individuals elsewhere. This mirrors earlier treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, Catholics in the 19th century, Jews in the early 20th century immigration debates. This pattern is quite consistent. So, language masks racism as security. Bias is framed as national security, not race. Policies are described as risk management, not discrimination. Cultural fear is recorded as counter extremism. This makes the racism harder to challenge because it is presented as technical or neutral. But when racism is disguised as religion, security, culture, or civilization, it becomes stronger, not less. It avoids the moral condemnation attached to overt racial hierarchy while producing the same exclusionary outcomes. So, anti Muslim bias in the U.S. is deeply tied to racism, even though it is rarely named as such. It operates through racial profiling, civilization narratives. You see those Muslims over there wearing those hijabs and stuff? Legal structures, selective enforcement, cultural dehumanization. This is not an accident or a fringe phenomenon. It is a systematic pattern with historical continuity. Fear based narratives about Muslims and Iran in particular prime U.S. audiences to interpret Iranian sufferings as menace rather than crisis. This framing suppresses empathy, obscures policy causes, and makes humanitarian collapse appear either deserved or irrelevant. So Iran becomes framed as a threat first, a society second. In U.S. media and political discourse, Iran is rarely presented as a country with farmers, cities, aging infrastructure, climate stress, water mismanagement. Instead, Iran is persistently framed as Islamic, hostile, irrational, aggressive. This primes audiences to fear Iran before understanding it. When a water system collapses under that framing, the reaction is not concern, it is indifference or suspicion. Because Iran is a Muslim majority country, its internal failures are often filtered through a civilization lens. Well, drought then becomes insatiable risk. Water protests become regime unrest. Suffering becomes background conditions. This is the same racialized logic used elsewhere. Suffering populations are not seen as civilians, but as potential threats. So, Iran's water crisis is not just mysterious, it involves dam overbuilding, groundwater over extraction, misaligned agriculture policy, climate change, sanctions driven infrastructure and decay. Yet fear based framing ensures that minimal coverage of policy errors, little discussion of international isolation effects, no sustained focus on the human cost. When a population like Iran is already cast as dangerous, their suffering does not demand explanation. This is a pattern, not an exception. The same dynamic has appeared repeatedly in U.S. history. Native communities were framed as hostile. Environmental devastation then got ignored. Vietnam was framed as an ideological threat, so civilian sufferings were minimized. Iraq was framed as a terror incubator, so infrastructure collapse was normalized. Iran clearly fits into this pattern. A water crisis is not just a technical failure, it is a predictor of mass migrations. Where do you think all those people are going to go? Unrest and regional instability. And ignoring it becomes the population is Muslim, is not neutral, it's dangerous. So when Americans hear Iran, they are trained to feel fear, not empathy. That fear makes it easy to ignore something as basic and as deadly as a nation running out of water. Talking about Iran and water, the fix was in years ago. Dams are an evolving story. I hope you're all paying attention. As a matter of fact, I would have to say that dams and nuclear facilities are two of my very favorite topics. I know, pretty surprising, huh? Who could have guessed? I will be playing a clip in a little bit because somebody really did a great job uncovering the history of all these dams, and they didn't cover what I'll be covering, so it's a great match for here. But I'd like to read you some of the comments. This was a clip that I'll be playing a little bit here about the ongoing water crisis in Iran, and it talks about the lousy decisions over the farming and all of that. They talk about them like they're surprised because, yeah, it does seem surprising, but when all these things add up, these decisions were meant to get them in the place they are right now. But let me read you a few of these comments. It couldn't happen to a better country. Another one, if you're coming to comment that instead of funding Hezbollah and making nuclear bombs and terrorists invest in water, you did it to yourself. It was commented already over 4,000 times. Thank you. The next one, no water in hell. Iran started to go down the tubes after the Shah. Religion took over and they went downhill. The Middle East has been fighting since the beginning of recorded time. They're never going to stop. There's never a time to build a thriving society. They're too busy hating and killing. The people in Iran don't seem to know that there is a water problem. On all the YouTube channels, these people still run water like they have plenty of it. No one seems to worry about conserving water. They leave the water running all the time. Iranians have a backwards mentality about everything. Maybe Allah cares. I don't. Iran supports Russia, so no water, then contact Russia and drink vodka. Simple. When you spend your energy and time destabilizing your neighbors, karma comes knocking soon enough. Decades of poor planning. Yep, sounds about right. And a severe lack of education. Should have sorted out water rather than those nukes. I also put down below, I've done a show about Iran. I've done a lot of work about Iran, and Iran is actually Iran is actually a major drug route. It's a trade route from the Middle East to the Netherlands and the United States, in case you need a refresher of what's really going on in Iran. There is a reason why Iran is covered in military bases. Just pull up a map. Look at military bases surrounding Iran. It is surrounded by military bases. I was kind of stumped about that for years until I finally figured out, well, because those military bases, they take the drugs that they get from their Iranian partners and fly them right out of there to where they're going to go. So, yeah, the U.S. military pretty tight with Iran, if I'd have to say so myself. So now we're entering another phase. I meant to move this up earlier, but I didn't. But let me tell you about it. It's important. They're talking about in our government now, there was something called the Monroe Doctrine, okay? And what they're doing is they're calling it the Don Doctrine. In other words, Don for Donald Trump, also known as the Don. Where'd we get that word, the Don? During Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, when they set the mob loose, this is when the Mafia Don, as we understand it, was effectively created. So, alcohol prohibition created enormous, steady revenue streams. Criminal organizations shifted from street gangs to corporate style syndicates. Leaders began operating strategically rather than personally violent. Figures such as Al Capone and Lucky Luciano exemplified this transition. So they replaced chronic feuds with structured governance. This is the birth of the Don, as a governing executive, not just a thug. So by the mid 20th century, Don came to mean the recognized head of a crime family. I couldn't make this up if I tried for the next 20 years. Authority was bureaucratic, layered, and insulated. Violence was delegated downward. Law enforcement, journalists, and courts began using this term consistently. The role now meant strategic decision maker, arbiter of disputes, controller of territory, labor, and revenue, publicly respectable, privately coercive. Yeah, it sounds like them, right? This model mirrored state power, not random criminality. And it really got fixed in with The Godfather in the 1970s. Popular culture reframed the Don as patriarchal, strategic, soft spoken but absolute, a ruler who uses loyalty and fear instead of constant violence. From this point on, Mafia Don emerged in everyday language as a metaphor for personalistic, unaccountable power. So, so when people today say someone acts like a Mafia Don, they are not invoking medieval Sicily. They're referencing a 20th century model of power, centralized authority, loyalty enforcement, rule breaking is normalized, and law treated as negotiable. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about these Eunuchs in case you didn't hear me right. Eunuchs. And I'm not going to go into great detail because I have another show. I'm down to I have about a dozen shows that I've got just about ready to record that I've been working on for a very long time. And one of them has to do with what's going on with the men and the boys. So I'll just introduce this Eunuch business for briefly here. I have much more about this Eunuch business in Iran over on my website. But for today, I'm just going to introduce a little bit about it. Iran was Parts of Iran were intermittently ruled after 1748. They were blinded and effectively controlled by what they call court eunuchs, who exercised real power behind the throne. So, the most explicit case of a Eunuchs ruler rather associated with Iran's 18th century political transition, what it means is this person was castrated as a child while a hostage, rose through military and court politics to found the Qajar dynasty. That's Qajar. This Yuke also became the Shah of Iran, ruling outright. His castration profoundly shaped his personality, I think so, governance style, and succession politics. So, although his reign technically begins at the end of the 1700s, his rise occurs squarely in the 18th century. So, why did Iran have these eunuchs at the time? Well, eunuchs controlled palaces, treasures, harems, and succession access. They were considered politically safe, no errors, making them ideal power brokers. During state collapse, administrative control mattered more than dynasty legitimacy. So, Iran in the 1700s had eunuchs exercising sovereign power. By the late 17th century, a eunuch, which was named Aga Mohammed Khan Qatar, ruled Iran directly as a Shah. So, late 1700s, this is a fact, according to their very own historians. Aga Mohammed Khan Qatar ruled Iran directly as the Shah. This was not an anomaly, but part of a wider imperial pattern, also seen in Ottoman court politics, especially in the 17th and 18th century. Eunuchs became indispensable political operators as central authority weakened. So, when empires centralized power in palaces, the eunuchs became the operating system, especially during the decline. Well, a eunuch is a male who has been castrated, the testes removed or rendered non functional, typically to eliminate reproductive capacity, most often for institutional, political, or social purposes rather than medical ones. In historical usage, a eunuch is not simply infertile and not metaphorical. The defining feature is intentional castration, usually performed when the word was first used. It was first used by the Greeks, and I have a lot more about these Greeks and the boys in the beds and sleeping with all these eunuchs and stuff. But basically, eunuch means keeper of the bed, guardian of the bedchamber. This reflects the role eunuchs played guarding royal sleeping quarters and harems. So, and it came earlier from the Greeks. So, eunuch is an intentionally castrated male, historically created for institutional control. The word was first recorded in ancient Greece, 5th century BCE. The practice predates the word by thousands of years. The role was a repeatable imperial solution, not a cultural oddity. This was most common in late imperial China, Ottoman domains, and the Qatar Iran, and the Mujad India. Eunuchs were not created because societies were strange or cruel by nature. They were created because the rulers feared rivals with bloodlines. Elites wanted servants without lineage, and systems prioritized control over human continuity. So that is a little bit of history about these eunuchs in Iran. But today I'm going to be covering the entire water situation. Right now, the news is screaming that Iran is out of water. They're screaming it at the rooftops. I'm not sure what all these riots going on right now in Iran are about. Could be about the water. They've been cutting off the internet, all kinds of things going on over there. But there's more to it. It's happened by cloud seeding, weather modification, emergency progress, projects, anything that looks like a technology rescue or move tons of people. So, how did Iran get into this situation in the very first place? I've spent a lot of time looking back at their crisis and their history behind Iran's water crisis and behind similar crises across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and even parts of the US is the same engine, a post World War II push by the United States and its development agencies to remake entire nations through dam building. So, right after World War II, they decided that dams would be modernized, that dams would be sold as progress, and they were sold as the future. And they did such a tremendous job that today, just mention to somebody, hey, I don't think that dams really serve a purpose. They will literally go sideways on you. What do you mean you don't think dams serve a purpose? What are you crazy? They deal with the water. Blah. They'll go on and on and on and on. They do not have a clue what they're talking about. Not one single clue. So what they pushed after World War II was, hey, this is a modern way. Let's control the water. And it was not just Iran. It was Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Egypt, Mexico, Ethiopia. Dozens of countries were told the exact same thing. The mark of a modern nation is a big dam. The message was scripted, rehearsed, and repeated for decades. It all came through the World Bank, through the State Department, through engineering firms, through Western universities, and through Hollywood documentaries that made dam builders look like the new saints of the industrial age. So, yeah, try telling somebody today that dams create disasters. They will stare at you like you're speaking another language. There's this belief that dams produce cheap electricity. It is not just sort of wrong, it is very wrong. It is one of the major reasons people cannot accept that dams are part of Iran's crisis. If dams are symbols of cheap power, progress, modernity, national pride, then admitting the dams were a failure seems like attacking the nation's identity. People defend dams because they believe dams give them cheap electricity. But that belief was built in the 1950s and the world has changed. The myth stayed the same, but the rivers did not. So, for decades, hydropower was promoted as cheap, renewable, and infinite. But by the late 2010s and early 2020s, something major has shifted. Global hydropower generation stopped growing. In many regions, it is shrinking outright. This is not an isolated phenomenon, it is structural. I found a report around 2018 to 2020 buried inside technical reports from the International Energy Agency and the World Bank. And they came up there. I think it's a quiet admission, if you ask me. They said hydropower growth has plateaued. So, in plain English, that means existing dams are generating less. New dams are not compensating. Many dams are aging out. Climate instability is reducing river flow. Oh, and before I forget, I posted this before about the U.S. has a lot of patents for water seeding and all that. I posted that at the bottom of my webpage. Just take a look at it. This all got started by seeding clouds and stuff by creating that water. So anyway, so hydropower is in fact in decline. Rivers are shrinking. Climate shifts are reducing snowpacks and rainfall in major hydropower regions like Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, India, Pakistan, China Southwest, California, Colorado River Basin, and Brazil. Hydropower depends on predictable river flow, and the planet no longer offers that predictability. So reservoirs are drying due to evaporation. Hotter temperatures pull massive amounts of water out of reservoirs. The hotter the region, the faster the loss. The Middle East is now experiencing the fastest evaporation rates in recorded history. When reservoirs shrink, electricity output plunges. I never have believed that it's powered electricity to begin with, but that's not what everybody else thinks. So, because right now the reservoirs are shrinking, and this is now happening at hundreds of dams. And what also is happening is rivers carry silt. Dams stop rivers. The silt falls to the bottom. And what happens is when you get to that bottom, you got some pretty deadly water at that bottom with all that silt. So over decades, the sediment reduces the reservoir capacity. It buries the intake valves. It erodes the turbines. It raises upstream water levels and it lowers downstream flow. So the result is less electricity every year. Most dams worldwide have lost 30 to 60% of their generating capacity due to sedimentation. Some are actually functionally dead. Almost all dams built between 1945 and 2000 were engineered using historical rainfall data, stable climate assumptions, predictable snow melt patterns. None of those assumptions remain true. The engineering models are outdated. Most large dams are now 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. Concrete cracks, turbines degrade, control systems break down, and spillways erode. Maintenance costs soar, and electrical output drops. Hydropower gets more expensive with age, not cheaper. So, hydropower became the least competitive source of renewable energy almost overnight once they came up with solar. But of course, they're getting rid of the solar stuff, but not for today. So, every region with heavy dam dependence is showing the same downward trend. Turkey's dams losing output from Euphrates decline. Iraq's dams are nearly non functional in many seasons. Iran's dams produce far less to dried rivers and sediment. Southeast Asia, India, and Pakistan experience unstable monsoons. Dams swing between flooding and complete drought. Hydropower reliability has collapsed. China, Southwest China has intermittent blackouts due to failing hydropower. Dams are producing far less than projected. In the United States, Colorado River dams like the Hoover and the Glen Canyon hit historically low output. California hydropower now fluctuates unpredictably. Several dams in the Pacific Northwest produce only a fraction of their design capability. And one thing to remember is this: recently there was flooding in Washington state. It's a very simple thing to research. All you have to do if you read that there's flooding somewhere, just get out a map, look for the dams, and there will be your answer. You will find that the route those where the flooding is coming from will tie directly to where those dams were. This is not rocket science. Hey, I can figure this out sitting in my house. So you can do it too. So if you hear about flooding, look for the dams. You'll find all the dams in the area that are actually causing that flooding. You don't have to listen to me, just use your own common sense. Let's continue on. South America. Brazil suffered a major hydropower collapse during drought years. Paraguay and Argentina face similar fluctuations. This is not a regional accident, it is a global pattern. Governments rely on the hydropower myth because the alternative is destabilizing. To admit hydropower is dying, that would mean admitting decades of planning were flawed, billions were wasted, dams damaged rivers permanently, entire nations bet their economy on collapsing infrastructure. Alternatives were ignored for too long. Politicians prefer to maintain the illusion of reliability. The public remains misinformed. Journalists repeated the myth. Schools teach outdated information. And dams keep producing less every single year. So Iran's crisis is not isolated. It will be the future for everyone. It is part of a global phenomena in which dam-based hydropower peaked decades earlier and has been declining ever since. Iran is currently experiencing mass evaporation, sedimentation, declining snowmelt, shrinking rivers, collapsing aquifilters. Old dams were built under Cold War ideology. New dams were built under political pressure. It all compounds. Hydropower is producing less. The reservoirs are drying. The rivers are failing. And cloud seeding is now being sold as the next miracle, just like dams were. Hydropower peaked decades ago. Since then, dams around the world have been generating less electricity every year, but governments refuse to say it out loud. Iran is not facing a surprise water crisis. This is not a surprise. It is facing the collapse of an entire model of development that was built after World War II. So, why do people believe that dams bring cheap electricity? Because that promise was repeated for decades. For 70 years, governments, engineering firms, and development agencies promised the same thing: hydropower is cheap, clean electricity. That line was pushed into school textbooks, documentaries, government press releases, engineering departments, news segments, Hollywood films. People absorbed the idea long before they ever saw a dam in person. When a message is repeated by authority figures for generations, it becomes common sense, even if the reality changed a long, long time ago. In the 1930s to 1950s, dams like Hoover, Grand Coulee, and Bonneville actually did provide cheap power for a growing industrial nation. But that early success became a permanent myth, even though river flows changed, climate changed, demand increased, maintenance costs skyrocketed, sediment buildup reduced output, reservoirs shrank, turbines aged, ecological damage was accumulated. The original truth became outdated, but the belief survived untouched. And the public never sees the real cost. People look at the dam and the power lines and they assume water flowing, free energy, but they never see the cost of building dams, the cost of relocating entire villages, the cost of repairing ancient and aging concrete, the cost of degrading sediment, the cost of reinforcing cracked structures, the cost of destroyed fisheries, the cost of salinized soil, the cost of collapsed aquifers, the cost of drought caused by upstream storage, the cost of emergency measures when reservoirs fail. Most hydropower becomes more expensive over time, not cheaper. But those numbers get hidden in government budgets and developmental bank reports that ordinary people never read. So, hydropower was labeled as renewable, clean, green, and sustainable. Yeah, we're the same nation of people. We allowed them to have us sort our frigging trash for 20 years. Plastic in this one, paper in that one, all to find out that was a big lie. So, people equate renewable with cheap, even though the two concepts have nothing to do with the other. The label itself became a psychological shortcut. So, electrical pricing is manipulated for political optics. Many governments artificially lower hydropower prices to appease citizens, appear competitive, attract industry, and stabilize urban populations. The public sees the low electricity bill and thinks the dam is responsible. They never realize the government, through your tax dollars, is quietly absorbing the real cost. So, if dams do not provide cheap electricity, people must confront a harder truth. The dam was a bad investment. Electricity will get more expensive. The country made irreversible water mistakes. The foundation of progress was flawed. No, it wasn't. This is all on purpose. This is about eugenics. The one thing we have to have is water, and the one thing they screwed up was water. Most people prefer a comforting story to an uncomfortable truth. So, in the last 20 to 30 years, rivers have actually weakened. Climate patterns have shifted. Reservoirs lost water. Millions of tons of sediment have piled up. Turbines operate below capacity. Hydropower plants in Iran, Turkey, Iraq, India, China, and even the U.S. now produce far less than promised. But the public still believes in the old story because no one told them that it had changed. But that belief did not come from nature, from science, or from evidence. It came from propaganda. So, in order to understand Iran today, you have to roll the whole story all the way back. The water crisis looks sudden, but it is decades in the making. The rivers drying up, the aquifers collapsing, the dust storms, the salt intrusion, the mass migration, the lakes turned into salt plains. None of this is new. These are the long term consequences of a development model that ignored local ecology and replaced it with an important ideology. And here is where the story starts to sound biblical, not because of religion, but because of the patterns. In the Bible, floods and droughts are never random punishments. They happen when a society pushes a system beyond its limits. When water is restrained unnaturally, held back, redirected, dammed up, and when corruption or arrogance builds structures that cannot hold, nature eventually breaks through. Floods reveal the truth. Droughts reveal the imbalance. The biblical writers understood a simple principle. If you try to control a system you do not understand, the system will eventually correct itself. And this is exactly what happened in Iran, and exactly what has happened across the developed world. The dam boom after World War II was a global ideology, and nations bought into it the way people buy into a myth. Dams became symbols of national strength, engineering brilliance, and Western modernity. Engineers were treated like priests, and the dams themselves became the temples of a new technological faith. The tragedy is that the ecological cost was hidden, denied, or dismissed. Well, yeah, they couldn't really say, hey, you know what? We understand that the human body needs water. Everybody's got to have water, right? Plants, dogs, cats, birds, bees, everybody's got to have water, right? So what are we going to do? Are we going to study water and really learn how? Hey, okay, let's call them over. Let's call the boys on the Guido. Hey, Guido, what do we do about this water thing for people? Hey, I say we muck it up. We muck it up so bad there's no repair, and in the end, the people will suffer because they have no water, and it will be just like that Bible, right? Famine, water, and famine are always on their agenda. This is a story about entire nations were sold a vision of progress that hollowed out the very land they depend on. And it all suspiciously happened after World War II. And I will get back to this Bible business in a bit. What I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be taking a break and I'll be playing this clip. The clip is almost about 30 minutes. It's well worth every minute of time. What I did was I found the clip after I'd written this show, so I just pulled out what I was going to say about it, and the clip will say what I was going to say because there's a lot to these borders. There's a lot to, like, for example, I was looking at some flooding over in that region, oh, I don't know, in the last year, and it was a flood going on in Pakistan, but really the dam the dam came out of India. So you got a lot of cross-border stuff going on. So I want to play this entire clip. I can't just clip it because you need to understand how this all has worked out. So just hang in there. I'll play the clip right now and I'll be back on the other side.
These protests have continued for 7 consecutive nights, and they have turned deadly. According to government officials, at least 3 people have been killed.
Iran is running out of water. The Islamic regime has outlived sanctions, sabotage, and uprisings, but it might not survive millions of thirsty citizens.
Water levels have fallen 15 meters over the past year. Environment officials say the government has plans to tackle the supply crisis. However, some Iranians aren't happy and have joined demonstrations calling for the government to do more.
The sound of gunshots as security forces use bullets to disperse protesters. People here are demonstrating against severe water shortages in one of Iran's hottest regions.
But the protests have developed into dissent against the government and the country's supreme leader.
Iran is so desperate that the government is thinking of importing water from neighboring countries. Yes, you heard that right, importing water. 5 brutal years of drought and about 40% less rainfall than usual means Tehran's reservoirs are critically low. Experts say the capital's main dam has barely 1 month of water left, meaning that by the end of September, Tehran could officially run out of water. And if the shortages weren't bad enough, reckless mismanagement has only made the crisis worse. Just this week, on August 19th, authorities admitted to an unexpected incident in the water network that left large parts of Khurramabad, home to 370,000 people, without drinking water. No one knows when services will return, if at all. But instead of fixing the actual problem, Iran's leaders decided the bigger issue was people talking about it. So they've decided to shut down the internet. As of now, 27 out of Iran's 31 provinces have zero internet, and only 4 have partial access. On top of that, millions of Iranians are dealing with 6 to 12-hour blackouts every single day. And in some areas, there's nothing at all. No power, no water, no connection to the outside world. Major dams like Lar and Latyan have dropped to less than 15% capacity, with some reports saying just 1% water remains. It's even worse in southern regions. Lakes have simply vanished, groundwater reserves have dried up, and countless towns haven't seen water flowing from their taps in weeks. But it wasn't always like this. A decade or so ago, Iran's water system was still holding together. Dams like Khakhe, Dez, and Karun kept fields green across Khuzestan and beyond. The Karun River, once Iran's largest and only navigable river, powered cities, fed industries, and kept the southwest alive. Even the Hamun wetlands on the Afghan border used to be the 7th largest wetland on Earth. But today it's pretty much just dust. Not because the rain stopped, but because the system rotted it from the inside. Corruption, greed, and decades of poor planning drained the country before the drought ever could. You see, Iran never had a lot of water to begin with. It only gets about 250 millimeters of rainfall each year. That's roughly a third of the global average. With numbers like that, you'd think careful planning would be priority number 1, but nah. For the better part of a century, Iran's rulers and elites chased after stupid goals. And now, regular Iranians are finally paying the price. Iran's leaders used to have an obsession for grand development projects, like building gigantic dams, chasing a green revolution, and even dreaming of turning deserts into lush, green paradises. Under the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, Iran used to get inspired by the United States. Mega projects like the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority captivated their imaginations. In fact, back in the 1950s, the Shah even hired an American company, led by former officials from the Tennessee Valley Authority, to completely redesign the water infrastructure of Iran's fertile Khuzestan province. The TVA had transformed poverty-stricken areas of America into productive farmland using dams, and the Shah dreamed of replicating that success. Soon enough, concrete dams and steel structures became symbols of progress, prestige, and modernity, and Iran's leadership wanted as many dams as possible, as quickly as possible. Whether those dams made practical sense or not, well, seems like nobody really bothered to check. By the late 1970s, dams were popping up everywhere, and the Shah's obsession with mega projects meant ordinary people's needs, like school, healthcare, or stable jobs, were often ignored. Frustration was building fast, but before people could really speak up, the 1979 Islamic Revolution swept in and changed everything. At first, ordinary Iranians hoped the new Islamic government would finally start paying attention to their basic needs, but that didn't happen. Instead, the revolutionary regime turned out to be just as stubborn as the old one. Even though the new Islamic regime fundamentally disagreed with almost every other policy of the Shah, they strangely embraced his vision that no river should go undammed. In fact, over the next few decades, Iran built dams at such an incredible pace that by the early 2000s, it had quietly become the world's third largest dam builder, just behind the global giants of China and Japan. During President Hashemi Rafsanjani's era, a new dam was completed every 45 days on average. People literally nicknamed him the construction commander for it. In roughly 3 decades, Iran built over 600 dams. That's roughly 20 dams every single year, one after another after another. They probably thought, just trap all the water in big reservoirs, then use it to irrigate fields, grow more crops, and produce electricity. Boom, problem solved. Sure, that sounds easy enough, but that's how kids fix problems, and apparently some politicians as well. This isn't fantasy land, though. It's the real world, where mistakes have real consequences. They'd only had bothered to listen to someone who understood how nature actually works. You see, Iran isn't Canada or Norway. It doesn't have endless rainfall or rivers flowing abundantly year-round. Iran's rivers have always been seasonal, and rainfall has historically been minimal. When you start choking each of these already limited streams and rivers with giant concrete barriers, you don't create abundance, you create fragmentation, scarcity, and environmental chaos. Dams drastically disrupt the natural flow of water. They suffocate wetlands, starve downstream farms, and block critical aquifers from recharging underground. A perfect example of this is Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran. It used to be the Middle East's largest saltwater lake. Today, it's a dry wasteland, barely 5% of its original size. And even when dams do manage to trap water, it's often a losing battle, especially in the scorching southern provinces, where temperatures regularly hit 50 degrees Celsius and sometimes even higher. These reservoirs end up losing massive amounts of precious water to evaporation. Ironically, these dams, the very projects intended to solve Iran's water crisis, ended up accelerating it. For example, in Khuzestan province, they built the Gotvin Dam in 2012, right on top of enormous salt beds. Yes, salt. And when the engineers proudly filled the reservoir, guess what happened? The water became saltier than soup, practically useless for farming or drinking. A multi-million-dollar engineering marvel ended up transforming a vital freshwater river into a massive salty pond. And then there's the classic mistake, or should I say, the hopeless dream of irrigating deserts. The idea was to channel dam-fed water into barren land, transforming arid deserts into fertile farmland. But desert soil is notoriously salty and incredibly thirsty. When you pour water into it, the soil quickly gulps it down, only to leave behind thick salt crusts that slowly poison the crops. Within just a few short years, farmers who had invested their livelihoods into these reclaimed lands saw their crops wither season after season. Eventually, they gave up entirely, leaving behind ghostly landscapes dotted with dried irrigation channels, rusted equipment, and crumbling homes. When I said they built countless dams without any sense, you probably expect issues like poor engineering, rampant corruption, and yes, Iran has plenty of both. But there was another problem too. Zero coordination between provinces. Each region wanted its own dams, its own projects, without any real planning or consideration for how this would affect other areas downstream. Every local leader wanted their own impressive concrete monument to gain favor from the Shah and secure their career prospects. The same pattern continued after the Islamic Revolution, and one company quickly realized it could turn this political stupidity into massive profits. That company was Khatam al-Anbiya, a construction giant controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. Because the IRGC held so much political weight, they effortlessly secured lucrative contracts, and nobody dared question whether these damn projects were practical or even necessary. In fact, when independent researchers attempted to investigate Iran's dam building spree a few years back, they found that detailed official records for hundreds of dams were either incomplete or completely missing from government archives. This was critical information like construction costs, environmental impact assessments, even precise dam locations, all suspiciously missing, making it nearly impossible to verify how much money had actually been spent or if the dams had been built responsibly at all. The madness of building dams only stopped when the water crisis became impossible to ignore. Public resentment grew, and eventually even Iran's own president at the time, Hassan Rouhani, started to get cold feet. When he took office in 2013, one of his first moves was calling for a halt on all new dam construction. He clearly saw how bad things had spiraled out of control, not only draining Iran of precious water, but also bleeding the treasury dry through shady, unnecessary mega projects. The craziest part is that Rouhani was right. According to experts, Iran now urgently needs to decommission at least 500 dams to even have a chance of restoring some environmental balance. Just imagine how expensive, counterproductive, and flat-out disastrous these past few decades of relentless dam building have been, ultimately causing nothing but human suffering, economic waste, and what's probably Iran's worst water crisis ever. But of course, dams are just one piece of Iran's long story of water mismanagement. The other half is about how water is actually used, or more accurately, misused, especially in agriculture. Iran's government, both pre and post 1979, were determined to achieve food self-sufficiency at all costs. The idea was to grow our own wheat, our own rice, our own everything, so we're not dependent on imports. A noble goal, perhaps, but they forgot that to grow all that food, you need enormous amounts of fresh, clean water, something Iran never had in abundance. Agriculture absolutely guzzles water, and Iran's farming practices were, and still frankly remain, shockingly careless and inefficient. Roughly 90% of Iran's entire freshwater supply goes directly to farming, and the worst part is much of that water gets completely wasted. Many Iranian farmers still rely on ancient flood irrigation methods, like flooding entire fields and just hoping something grows. The average irrigation efficiency across the country is about 35%. Meaning that nearly 2/3 of the precious water they pour onto their fields either evaporates or seeps away before it ever benefits a crop. To put this into perspective, modern drip irrigation systems easily exceed 90% efficiency. And if this wastage wasn't bad enough, transporting water to fields through open-air canals or broken, leaky pipes wastes about another 12%. Imagine the sheer scale of negligence and the total disregard, not only for today but for future generations as well. For decades, none of this seemed to matter. Back then, Iran's population was smaller, wells were shallow and abundant, and nobody worried about water efficiency, because frankly, nobody had to. But now, Iran has roughly 90 million mouths to feed, and those outdated methods just aren't cutting it anymore. In many rural areas today, farmers are forced to drill deeper and deeper wells each year. But there's only so far they can drill before hitting rock bottom. And that day, for millions of Iranians, is already here. For decades, diesel-powered pumps have been relentlessly sucking out every last drop of groundwater from Iran's aquifers. In fact, according to one climatologist's estimate, in less than 50 years, Iran has drained nearly 70% of its groundwater reserves. Reserves that took nature thousands of years to fill up. And do you know what happens when you recklessly drain groundwater like that? The land itself begins to collapse. Around Tehran and other heavily exploited regions, land subsidence is becoming a frighteningly real phenomenon. In some places, the surface drops by 25 to 30 centimeters every single year, because once those underground reservoirs empty out, the earth above it has nothing left to hold it up. Buildings are cracking apart, roads are buckling, bridges and railroads are shifting, and deep fissures, some big enough to swallow a person, are tearing open farmers' fields. Some areas are dropping tens of centimeters every single year as empty aquifers collapse beneath the surface. Buildings are cracking, roads are buckling, and deep fissures are splitting open farmers' fields. It's as if Mother Nature herself finally ran out of patience, deciding they've taken enough and decided it was time to settle the score. But you know what's even more frustrating? After wasting so much precious water on agriculture to the point of draining aquifers, Iran ended up growing the worst possible crops, in the worst possible places, and at exactly the worst possible times of the year. Now, historically, Iran's agriculture revolved around drought-tolerant grains like barley, adapted to its dry climate. But in the 20th century, Iranian diets evolved, and government policies aggressively pushed for cultivating water-hungry crops like wheat and rice, all across the nation, even in places that made absolutely no sense. Imagine trying to grow rice, a notoriously thirsty crop, in provinces like Isfahan or even Sistan-Baluchistan. In Sistan, farmers were even encouraged or sometimes pressured into planting watermelons. Watermelons! Each kilogram of watermelon needs around 170 liters of water. Did Iranians know this? Probably not, but the policymakers definitely should have. Anyone with common sense can see how absurdly irresponsible it is to grow such thirsty crops in a region receiving barely 2 inches of rain per year. Thankfully, the Iranian government eventually caught on, at least partially, and announced a ban on all rice cultivation in these water-scarce regions. But by that time, it was far too late. The damage had already been done. Vast areas had been salinized, aquifers depleted, and livelihoods ruined. And finally, there's something else making all of these problems infinitely worse. Something that is not entirely Iran's fault alone, but rather shared by all of humanity: climate change. The truth is, nature is fair to everyone. Animals, humans, it doesn't matter. You mess with nature, and it'll mess right back, often with devastating consequences. And that is exactly what's happening in Iran. Not only is the ground beneath their feet literally sinking, but Iran is also warming twice as fast as the global average. In fact, the country's average temperature has risen roughly 0.4 Celsius per decade. That's double what the whole world has experienced. Now, 0.4 Celsius per decade might not sound like much at first, but trust me, it adds up fast. Year after year, it transforms summers into longer, hotter heat waves and causes evaporation rates to skyrocket. Iranian summers have always been hot, sure, but recently they've begun to push the absolute limits of human endurance. In Avaz, a city located in southwestern Iran, temperatures reached an almost unimaginable 53.7 degrees Celsius in June 2017. That is 129 degrees Fahrenheit. It's one of the hottest temperatures ever recorded anywhere on Earth. In conditions like these, reservoirs behind dams don't stand a chance. Water evaporates incredibly fast. The soil becomes bone dry, crops demand even more irrigation, and people desperately crank up their air conditioners, many of which use water-intensive cooling towers. It creates a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle, making the crisis even worse. And then there's the rainfall, or rather the lack of rainfall. In the winter of 2018, Sistan and Baluchistan province received only 29 millimeters of rain, less than a third of what the region typically needs. Farmers pray desperately for the spring rains, but more often than not, those rains simply never come. And when the rain does finally show up, it's usually in short, intense bursts that trigger flash floods rather than soaking gently into the ground. The water rushes away, wasted, while the land remains thirsty. Now, like I've said before, you can't really blame Mother Nature for this. The government should have planned better. For years now, Iran has repeatedly seen severe droughts one year and violent floods the next, all while temperatures steadily climb higher and higher. Scientists project that if the current trends continue, by the end of the century, the Middle East, including Iran, could see average temperatures rise by a staggering 5 degrees Celsius. That would turn the entire regions of the Gulf into outdoor ovens, where even short periods outside become unbearable, let alone working in fields or walking to school. Streets would empty during daytime hours. Outdoor labor would become dangerously impossible, and the elderly, children, or anyone vulnerable would face life-threatening heat exposure. But that's only if people in this region manage to survive and somehow overcome the devastating water crisis they're already facing right now. Already today, Iran's water crisis has reached nearly every corner of the country. 19 out of the country's 31 provinces are facing a severe drought, forcing entire towns to rely on water trucks and endure strict rationing, often getting barely enough to scrape by. In Sistan and Baluchistan alone, roughly 1/5 of the population, around 500,000 people, have either already left their homes or on the brink of migrating due to water scarcity. Most of them are farmers and herders who have watched helplessly as their livestock died off, and their once fertile land turned into barren dust. And with wetlands drying up completely, dust and sandstorms are becoming more frequent and more terrifying. The city of Zabul in Sistan was named the world's most polluted city by the World Health Organization in 2016, thanks to relentless dust storms filling the air with choking microscopic particles. And those storms are wreaking havoc on public health. Respiratory illness, asthma, and lung infections have skyrocketed, with hospitals packed to capacity, especially during the notorious 120-day wind season. And do you know what the Iranian government has been doing about it for the last decade? Well, every now and then they hand out face masks, close schools temporarily, and urge people to stay indoors. That's pretty much it. But the problem is, these dust storms can sometimes rage for 4 months straight. You can't exactly ask people to barricade themselves inside their homes for months on end. And even if they tried, some storms are so intense that staying indoors doesn't even offer that much protection. Dust creeps in through every crack, windows rattle with the howling wind, and the people trapped in these miserable conditions either find a way out or endure life in a relentless nightmare. The Iranian government does realize it's facing a crisis, but their way of handling it? Well, let's just say it mostly boils down to praying and hoping that the problem fixes itself. Sure, faith can work wonders, but it's usually not the government's job to gobble up taxpayer money just to sit around praying with them. I kid you not, this actually happened. In late 2021, farmers in Isfahan were protesting after their river, the Zayande Rud, completely dried up. Instead of offering concrete solutions, Ayatollah Alamahoda, a prominent hardline cleric, who happens to be President Raisi's father-in-law, actually scolded these desperate farmers and told them the only solution was to pray harder for rain. You can probably guess how well that advice went down, with farmers watching their fields turn to dust. For ordinary Iranians, patience was already wearing thin. This was just the fuel for the fire. Take Khuzestan, for example. Traditionally, this southwestern province has been blessed with abundant water, thanks to the Karun and Karkhe rivers. These rivers used to flow steadily, feeding rich farmlands, supplying towns and cities, and nourishing the internationally famous Mesopotamian marshes downstream. But decades of reckless dam building, over-irrigation, and increasingly severe drought has changed all of that. By the scorching summer of 2021, Khuzestan was facing one of its worst crises ever. By mid-July, with temperatures soaring past 50 degrees Celsius, things had gotten desperate. Town after town across Khuzestan watched helplessly as their taps went dry for days at a time, leaving tens of thousands without basic drinking water in the brutal heat. Driven by sheer desperation, people hit the streets. What began as peaceful, desperate gatherings demanding water quickly escalated into widespread anti-government protests across the province. I still remember watching those videos, at least a few that managed to slip through Iran's heavy internet censorship, showing crowds chanting, "We are thirsty," and also more political slogans like "Down with the Islamic Republic." It was stunning how quickly the chants evolved from pleading for water to essentially telling the regime to go to hell. In one town, protesters even shouted, "Reza Shah, bless your soul," openly praising the same dictator Iranians had kicked out decades earlier. You know a country's in deep trouble when ordinary folks start missing a former dictator. Now, surprisingly, even Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, publicly acknowledged that protesters weren't exactly wrong to be upset. An unusually empathetic statement from a man who rarely sides with protesters. But while he was busy saving face and trying to calm things down, security forces, they were doing the opposite. They cracked down brutally, firing live ammunition into crowds. Several young men lost their lives. Blood literally spilled over water. Dozens more were arrested. And yet, the protests kept going for over a week. People in cities like Tehran and Isfahan took to their rooftops at night, chanting slogans to show solidarity. Something as basic as thirst had sparked one of the country's biggest unified protests. After all, if a government can't provide even water? What good is it? Even the authorities, who normally wouldn't think twice about crushing protests with brute force, were hesitant at first. Probably because even they realized how terrible it would look to shoot people whose only crime was begging for water. Still, in the end, force was used, and eventually the protests faded away. Authorities made plenty of promises, yet nothing really changed. Even now, Khuzestan remains trapped in relentless drought. Its people are still thirsty, frustrated, and forgotten. Then, just a few months later, in November of 2021, similar protests erupted in Isfahan, a historic city right in the heart of central Iran. For centuries, Isfahan had been known as an agricultural hub and a cultural jewel, famous for its picturesque Zayande Rud river flowing gracefully beneath beautiful, ancient arched bridges. Or at least that's how things used to be. Today, sadly, the river is reduced to nothing but dry, cracked riverbed of sand, starved of water by overuse and diverted through pipelines to other provinces and industries. Now, naturally, the farmers in the region, especially those downstream, were outraged. To them, their river had literally been stolen, their livelihoods left to wither. In protest, they started a peaceful sit-in, camping directly on the dried-up riverbed near the famous Kaju Bridge. Initially, it was just a handful of farmers, but within 2 weeks, their protest attracted thousands of ordinary Isfahanis, urban residents, merchants, and entire families. Parents even brought their kids along, and the atmosphere felt more like a large picnic or a peaceful rally for water justice than a traditional protest. Even Iran's tightly controlled state TV briefly covered the protests, a rare move that made it seem, just for a moment, that authorities might actually let people speak. But as the crowds continued growing, chants inevitably became more political, and soon enough, the regime lost patience. On November 25th, 2021, security forces finally showed what they're unfortunately best known for. Tents were set on fire. bulldozers moved in, and police swung batons and fired tear gas to chase everyone away. Families fled the riverbed, farmers were beaten, and peaceful protests turned violent overnight. But this brutality only ignited greater anger. By evening and into the next day, Isfahan erupted into fierce street battles between protesters and riot police. Furious crowds chanted slogans calling for the death of the supreme leader and vowed that they would fight back. Women stood face to face with security officers, demanding to know why they were shooting at people who were merely asking for water. Yet tragically, the police kept shooting. They fired shotguns loaded with birdshot directly into the crowds, injuring dozens. Some protesters, including elderly farmers, were left severely wounded, many with their eyes permanently damaged and their bodies peppered with pellets. Graphic images and videos of bloodied faces quickly went viral, and predictably, the government shut down internet access across the region, and within a few days, even this protest was crushed into silence. And, just like before, all the government's promises and reassurances afterward amounted to absolutely nothing. No real change came. Farmers and residents continued to suffer in silence. But now, protests like the ones in Isfahan and Khuzestan are spreading once again. Not just in a few provinces, but practically across the entire country. But apart from internal unrest, this water crisis is also why Iran's relationships with neighbors like Afghanistan and Iraq have been so strained for decades. You see, Iran sits downstream of several vital rivers flowing from neighboring countries. Yet, at the same time, it's also upstream of rivers feeding into places like Iraq. And when everyone around you is fighting tooth and nail for every last drop of water, being stuck in the middle like Iran makes an already bad situation much, much worse. Flowing from Afghanistan's mountains into Iran's southeastern province of Sistan-Baluchistan is the Helmand River, known as Hirmand to the Iranians. For centuries, communities on both sides depended on Helmand's water for farming, fishing, and even basic survival. Naturally, disputes over who gets how much water go back a very long way, at least as far back as the 1800s, when the British were still meddling in Afghan affairs. Afghanistan, being upstream, controls the river's source and naturally wants to keep more water for itself. Starting in the 1950s, Afghanistan began building dams and canals along the Helmand, drastically reducing the water flowing downstream to Iran. To ease tensions, both countries finally signed a treaty in 1973, promising Iran a fixed share of Helmand's waters each year. At the time, it seemed like a fair enough compromise, but the treaty quickly became meaningless as Afghanistan plunged into decades of chaos, political coups, the Soviet invasion, civil wars, the Taliban takeover followed by the US invasion, and eventually the Taliban returning again, thus leaving the treaty mostly ignored and unenforced. Now fast forward to today. Afghanistan is once again controlled by the Taliban, and they're determined to not let go of any water they desperately need themselves. They've built several large dams, including the Kamal Khan and the Khajaki dams, to capture more water upstream, hoping to secure their own agriculture and drinking supply. Now, from their perspective, this makes perfect sense. Afghanistan faces its own severe drought, and they're trying to ensure their people have enough water. But downstream in Iran, these dams have made an already bad situation even worse. For Iran, the 1973 treaty guaranteeing its share of Helmand's water might as well have never existed. Tehran is accusing Afghanistan of violating the agreement, but Afghanistan responds by saying their own reservoirs are mostly empty, and there's simply not enough water left to release downstream. It's become a classic case of two desperate neighbors, both suffering, both convinced they're in the right, and neither willing or even able to budge. Fed up with empty promises, in 2023, Iranian President Raisi publicly demanded the Taliban finally deliver Iran's rightful share of water, or face consequences. The Taliban immediately warned Iran to watch its tone. Eventually, the tension escalated until soldiers on both sides opened fire. By the end of the clash, 2 Iranian soldiers and 1 Taliban fighter were dead. People literally killed each other over water. It was the worst border violence between Iran and Afghanistan in years. Afterward, both countries talked about setting up joint committees to resolve the water dispute, but those discussions have largely stalled, going nowhere. And there's a good reason why Iran is so suspicious of the Taliban. Back in the late 1990s, during the Taliban's first period in power, they completely shut down the sluice gates of the Khajaki Dam after a political dispute, stopping the Helmand River from flowing into Iran entirely. Iranians haven't forgotten this brutal lesson. They understand perfectly well that the Taliban would have no problem weaponizing water again if it suited their interests. The funny thing is, Iran has confidently built its own set of dams, 4 massive reservoirs in the Sistan region, expecting to store the promised Helmand water, but that never came. And today those reservoirs sit bone dry and abandoned. Now, every single summer, Iran anxiously plays a waiting game. Will Afghanistan release water, or will Iran have to send yet another angry delegation to Kabul? This water is a lifeline for tens of thousands of people in Sistan. So it doesn't take much imagination to see how quickly tensions could escalate into actual conflict. Iranian officials and local media have already started throwing around terms like water war, and honestly, it's easy to see why. But do you know what's ironic? Exactly what the Taliban is doing to Iran, Iran is turning around and doing the exact same to Iraq. To the west, Iran controls several important rivers and tributaries that feed into Iraq's Tigris River. Recently, Iraq accused Iran of choking off those water sources. Iran has been aggressively building dams, digging tunnels, and diverting rivers deep into its own territory, often without even consulting Iraq first. Since around 2020, Iranian projects like the Daryan Dam have cut off nearly 85% of the Sirwan River's flow, directly affecting over 100,000 Iraqis in Kurdistan. On top of that, Turkey and Syria have also built dams upstream, further reducing the river flows into Iraq. All of this has already sparked mass migrations and a humanitarian catastrophe. Back in 2018, Basra, Iraq's second largest city, suffered a severe water crisis, as upstream diversions left the city's water dangerously salty and contaminated, sending tens of thousands to hospitals with severe illnesses. And since then, the situation has only gotten worse. Diplomatic talks regularly go nowhere, often ending up as little more than empty promises. In this worsening climate scenario, everyone's right and everyone's wrong. Each country desperately needs water, but grabbing more for oneself leaves neighbors thirstier. Without cooperation, it's a race to the bottom, to the dry. And trust me, that's a race no one wants to win. So, is there any hope? Are there any solutions? Or is Iran inevitably headed straight towards day zero, the day when the taps run dry? Well, Iran certainly has some options, and it's actually already trying a few. But whether those efforts will be enough, well, that's a trillion-toman question. One immediate fix Iran has desperately turned to is desalinization, basically converting seawater into drinkable water. Since you can't magically force rain clouds to appear, despite the government's prayer campaigns, the best thing is tapping into the vast saltwater reserves like the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. There's a big plan underway to pipe desalinated water from the Sea of Oman northward, all the way into the parched region of Sistan, and even further into the interior. The cost is estimated at around $4 billion. Another massive project involves pumping desalinated water from the Persian Gulf straight into Iran's dry central plateau, to thirsty provinces like Kerman and Yazd. They've already laid hundreds of kilometers of pipeline and constructed desalinization plants, but they're outrageously expensive and bring their own set of environmental nightmares. Desalinization consumes massive amounts of energy and leaves behind concentrated, salty brine that is harmful to marine ecosystems. An official estimated that just one of these desalinization projects costs around $400 million each year to operate. To put that into perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire annual earning of Isfahan province's agricultural sector. That's an insane amount of money to spend on bringing water to grow crops that aren't even worth that much money. If only they'd spent all those billions on sensible and genuinely useful solutions, instead of throwing them away on countless pointless dams, today, Iran might actually be exporting fresh water to other drought-stricken nations. But as things stand, these desperate, last-minute desalinization projects feel more like an expensive band-aid than an actual cure. And the real elephant in the room, or maybe an entire herd of elephants, is climate change, and the irreversible damage that's already been done. Groundwater aquifers don't refill overnight. In fact, some aquifers may have been drained so severely that they may never fully recover, no matter how much rain falls. Lakes like Urmia would require decades of massive, consistent water inflows just to come back to its original state. Moreover, climate projections are merciless. Iran is likely to see a future of longer, harsher droughts and significantly less rainfall. Even if, by some miracle, Iran managed to seal every leaky canal, shut down every wasteful farm, and miraculously achieve flawless water efficiency overnight, the brutal truth is, it might already be too late. A few years ago, Issa Kalantari, the former head of Iran's Department of Environment, warned that unless Iranians drastically change their habits, as many as 50 million people, roughly 70% of the country's entire population, could soon be forced to migrate, desperately searching for water in the decades ahead. Sure, it sounds apocalyptic, but maybe we're already witnessing the first signs of it today. Several villages in places like Sistan have already turned into ghost towns. Roughly 30% of the residents have relocated to the suburbs or nearby cities, and it's only getting worse, not just there, but in many other provinces too. But where would tens of millions of people even go? Likely they'd head first to the big cities, Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan, but those cities themselves are already strained to their limits, facing severe water shortages that climate projections say are only going to get worse. If millions start arriving each year, those urban areas would collapse under the strain, and pretty soon people would have no choice but to leave the country entirely. We'll soon be staring down the barrel of a massive refugee crisis on a scale we've never seen before. Iran's water crisis is fundamentally a man-made disaster that are worsening with climate shifts, which also means humans, fallible as we are, also have the power to avoid it. Maybe Iran will pull itself together, take decisive action, and somehow come out of this victorious? And honestly, the world should be watching closely. Every move, every decision, because if a country like Iran can claw its way back from water bankruptcy, there's genuine hope for countless other parched regions across the globe. But if they don't, we'll witness what happens when a civilization runs out of its most basic resource.
Okay, I'm back. And let me see here. I don't know why it always sounds different. But anyway, so no dams in the Bible. The reason I bring up the Bible is this. They've had control of the Bible for a very long time. I would argue they wrote the entire Bible themselves. But hey, you got to believe what you got to believe, right? So my belief, full stop, they wrote the Bible. So it doesn't have to be your belief. This is why people should be able to discuss things civilly, right? Just because I don't like the Bible doesn't mean you don't have to like the Bible. We're not joining some sort of cult here, even though we live in a cult environment. So, okay, in biblical times, there were no large-scale dam projects, no concrete structures, no hydropower, no artificial reservoirs, no river blocking mega projects. People used canals, irrigation ditches, levees, small stone wires, which are low river walls but not dams, cisterns, and storage pits. So the technology of dams does not appear because it did not exist at the time. But the Bible does describe the dangers of trying to control water unnaturally. It says, even without dams, biblical writers understood water held back can break through, infrastructure can fail, floods expose corruption, poor construction collapses under pressure, societies cannot dominate nature, arrogance toward natural systems leads to ruin. The warnings are the same. The technology just wasn't. So here's some theme examples. Walls built with untempered mortar collapsing, reservoirs drying and exposing foundations, floodwaters overwhelming structures, artificial systems failing under stress, rivers diverting, bringing destruction, modern or hidden corruption revealed when water breaks loose. So that were themes that come out of the Bible. The closest biblical word to dam is cistern, Cistern. And cisterns always symbolize failure. A cistern in the Bible is a man made pit or tank for storing rainwater. When prophets talk about cisterns, they always emphasize broken cisterns, leaking storage, false security, systems that cannot hold water, human attempts to replace natural flows. And for example, in Jeremiah 2:13, they have dug for themselves broken cisterns that cannot hold water. This is the ancient equivalent of criticizing engineered water systems that seem secure but fail catastrophically. Biblically, stored water equals a false promise unless it is aligned with nature. This is exactly the critique of modern dams. The Bible repeatedly warns against holding back waters unnaturally. Even though dams didn't exist, the idea of restraining water appears as a danger. Job 12:15. If he holds back the water, they dry up. If he lets them loose, they devastate the land. This is dam logic in ancient language. Restraint equals drought. Release equals flood. Imbalance equals disaster. So the Bible directly acknowledges the consequences that modern dam engineers rediscovered thousands of years later. Rediscovered after they wrote the Bible, right? They could have written that Bible. Well, they didn't really publish the Bible until they conveniently had the printing presses, so you do the math. So Ancient Israel knew about engineered water failures through neighbors. While Israel, did not build dams, other ancient civilizations did attempt. They attempted large irrigation works, canal diversions, levee systems, water redirection for agriculture. So, biblical prophets were aware of these engineering catastrophes. Yeah, because they wrote the book, right? I mean, there is that explanation, right? The writers of the book were the people that are going to plan to get these dams going up. So, yeah. So, the Bible's silence on dams is itself telling. If dams had existed, the Bible's flood imagery would have been even more explicit. But the absence of dams actually highlights something important. The biblical warnings about water imbalance were written when rivers were still free. Today, most rivers are trapped behind dams, and the consequences the Bible warned about are now literal. The Bible never mentions dams because they didn't exist yet, but it describes exactly what happens when humans try to restrain or redirect water unnaturally. The warnings are the same. When water is held back, it brings drought. When the restraint fails, it brings floods. And when a society pretends it can control nature indefinitely, the collapse exposes everything was built on false promises. So, where did the word dam even come from? The English word dam, or DAM, comes from the Proto Germanic root damas, meaning a structure to stop or regulate water. The root shows up across Germanic languages. In Old English, the word appears as dam, DAMM, meaning a pond, barrier, or embankment that holds water. This form is already extremely close to the modern spelling. Then the Middle Dutch and Middle Low German influence. The clearest ancestor to the English spelling is Middle Dutch dam, DAM, meaning a barrier of earth or timber across water. This makes sense because medieval trade and engineering terminology often spread from the Netherlands. Gee, I wonder why that happened. Good morning, Netherlands. Dutch culture was famous for water control and land reclamation. Dutch engineers and water management terms influenced English vocabulary significantly. We also see it in their words like Amsterdam, dam on the Ansel River, Rotterdam, dam on the Roddy River, Edam, Volendam, and Zabam all describe settlements next to a dam. So English likely reinforced or adopted the clean spelling from the Dutch. Unlike many words that evolved, dam has nearly identical meanings for over 150 years, meaning barrier, obstruction, water stopper, structure to hold back water. The definition barely changed because the technology itself remained similar until the modern era. So the word dam actually spread because Germanic tribes built water barriers. Dutch water engineering heavily influenced Europe. English adopted many Dutch terms using the medieval and early modern periods. Early industrial engineers used Dutch and German manuals, so the spelling and concept stabilized very early on. But the Bible does not mention man made dams. The Germanic and Dutch cultures named entire cities after dams, which shows how central the idea of water control was to their own identity. This also explains why Western nations later believed deeply in large dam projects, or they believed in eugenics, is why they believed in it, really. The notion of holding back water is culturally embedded in Northern European thought. So the word dam, DAM, comes from Old Dutch and Old Germanic roots. It originally meant exactly what it means today, a barrier to hold back water. The technology changed, but the word stayed the same. The idea of stopping a river is ancient in Europe, but exporting the idea to places like Iran with totally different climates and ecologies is what helped create the water disasters that we're seeing right now. Pre-modern dams were small, local, made of earth, rock, or timber, intended to raise water levels slightly, used for irrigation or mills. Nothing even remotely resembled Hoover Dam, the Answar High Dam, Iran's Karun dams, the massive Cold War era hydropower complexes. The idea of a huge, high, concrete, river wide structure holding back a massive reservoir is a modern concept. A few early 20th century dams experimented with larger scales, like the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona in 1911, some British irrigation dams, a few colonial projects in India and Africa. But these were still mid sized, and the science of large concrete gravity dams was not yet mature. No country was building dozens or hundreds. No one claimed dams could modernize entire nations. Hydropower was still on the fringe. The real breakthrough came in the 1930s New Deal. The New Deal in the United States created the Hoover Dam in 1936, the Grand Coulee Dam in 1942, and the Bonneville Dam. This matters because it created the first real dam propaganda. Engineering firms provided engineering firms proved they could build enormous structures. Hydropower became linked with national pride. Dams were sold as symbols of progress and civilization. I guess they just left off the eugenics part for clarity, right? Hey, we're going to build all these dams and soon you'll be dead underwater. That's the beauty of dams. So these constructions were technologically marvels and political tools. But the global megadam ideology was still forming. After World War II, everything changed. And here is a key piece of information. Listen carefully. The United States, the World Bank, and Western engineering firms pushed megadams globally as part of the Cold War development policy. This is where Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, and Brazil, all of them enter the picture. The message was clear. A real nation has big dams. This was tied to modernization, anti communism, industrialization, electrification, and of course, nation building. And the U.S. foreign policy treated dams as a tool of influence. And here is the key word: the World Bank. Remember those people? The World Bank, up to no good, never up to any good, became almost a dam financing agency from the 1950s to the 1980s. Your country wants a dam, the World Bank and those crooks will make sure you get the money to build that dam. So, why did mega dams spread after World War II? The world needed reconstruction. War torn regions needed electricity, irrigation, food production, and infrastructure. Dams were marketed as one shot solutions that could do everything at once. U.S. engineering firms needed global projects. Imagine that. American engineering giants like Bechtel, Morris and Knudsen, and Harza Engineering expanded overseas with U.S. political backing. They exported the Hoover model to the entire world. So, at the root of all of this, the very root of all of this, is in fact the United States. And then they brought in their buddies at the World Bank. The World Bank needed global showcase projects, and dams were big, visible, dramatic, and politically impressive. They became symbols of modernization for developing nations. And then there was the Cold War psychological warfare. Infrastructure was a weapon of influence. Wherever the Soviets built roads, the U.S. built and financed dams. Iran was a prime target of this competition. Iran's dam era was entirely post World War II. Iran built almost no major dams before 1950, several pilot dams in the 1950s, dozens of dams from 1960 to 1979 during the Shah, a massive wave of dams after 1990s, more than 600 dams by the 2010s. All of this growth was based directly, and I mean directly, on U.S. Cold War water ideology. The ideology was this: modern nations build dams. It was exported actually like a religion, and those churches came into the picture here. So, why the concept of dams did not exist earlier? Large dams required reinforced concrete, industrial steel, complex hydrology models, large scale explosives, bring out the TNT, kaboom, geological surveys, massive machinery, electrical grid infrastructure, and most importantly, global financing. Bring in the sharks at the World Bank. None of these existed before the early 20th century. Even the ideology of global dam building did not exist until after World War II. That was the root of things, after World War II. So, why don't people understand them? People assume dams are ancient, like pyramids or canals. But the word dam is ancient. The idea of damming rivers is ancient. The technology of megadams is brand new thanks to the United States of America and the World Bank. People confuse the word with the technology, just as car is a simple word. But a modern car is completely different from a horse cart. The idea of a dam changed dramatically after World War II. The idea of a giant river blocking megadams is not ancient at all. It was born after World War II, pushed by the United States as a symbol of modernity and exported around the world as a solution to everything. Iran bought the myth like everyone else, and now the ecological bill is due. So they frame this in the Bible. I have more of the Bible over my webpage. I'll read you a couple things. Isaiah 28:17. The hail will sweep away your refuge, and the water will overflow your hiding place. This passage presents water not as random destruction, but as a force that reveals hidden weaknesses. In the ancient worldview, water was a test of legitimacy. Any structure built on lies, corruption, or shortcuts would be swept away when the water when the water rose. Then there's Job 12:15. If he holds back the water, they dry up. If he lets them loose, they devastate the land. The imagery suggests that water is inherently powerful but temporarily restrained. Once the restraints fail, devastation is inevitable. This aligns with modern dam failures. They are not caused by water behaving badly, but by human systems claiming control they never fully had. Proverbs 27:4. Floods cannot drown love. Yet the metaphor implies that floods drown nearly everything else. Floods represent the overwhelming truth that sweeps away human illusions of control. So, to ancient writers, a flood symbolized a system pushed past its limits. It was not divine rage, but the exposure of human arrogance. This makes the biblical worldview far more sophisticated than the version taught in most churches. So, anyway, so yeah, biblical literature repeatedly uses water to describe revelation rather than vengeance. Well, I don't know. You're going to have to interpret these things however you want to interpret them, but they say when dams fail, everything governments concealed about water mismanagement becomes impossible to ignore. Floods are not metaphors of anger, but metaphors of forced clarity. In biblical literature, fire and water are twin forces that dismantle human hubris. Water is a collapse of systems, exposure, structural weakness, collective failure. Fire, destruction of what remains, unmasking of the built environment, internal combustion, systematic burnout. So, dams represent the water side, data centers represent the fire side. Both are infrastructures built with haste, political ego, and more optimism than engineering humility. And how churches misread danger to retain power. Church institutions rely on a model where clergy interpret disasters. By reframing natural events as moral events, they keep themselves indispensable. This model creates a cycle of disaster, fear, clergy interpretation, and obedience. This mechanism has worked for over a millennium. Fear is a more effective tool than understanding. Fear achieves instant compliance. Nuance requires education, time, and autonomy. Historically, church attendance spikes after disasters. People crave meanings during chaos, and the church positions itself as the source of meaning. But before scientific understanding, clergy had no explanation for floods, earthquakes, droughts, or epidemics, or fires for that matter. Rather than admit uncertainty, they offered moral explanations. These explanations stuck culturally long after science replaced them. Many Christians today still talk about weather as if it was a moral character or actor. Disaster as a tool for deflecting responsibility. By blaming sin for disaster, churches conveniently avoid discussing corruption, infrastructure failure, political incompetence, misuse of funds, poor engineering, questionable alliances, and environmental mismanagement. By saying God is punishing us, protects the powerful and silences inquiry. The same logic shields failed dam projects in Iran and elsewhere. The moral story replaces the engineering story. Ancient Hebrew writers describe a universe where cause and effect govern outcomes. They do not present God as a being who lashes out in anger at weather. Churches simplify the text into fear based lessons for children and peasants. This is not the Bible, it is institutional psychology. If people believe that every disaster is a divine punishment, they will always return to the clergy for interpretations, for comfort, for protection, for ritual, for guidance. Fear keeps the hierarchy intact. Many people do not react to factual content when you mention dams, they react to conditioning. Because dams after World War II were aggressively promoted as the hallmark of modernity. They were pressed as technological triumphs, humanitarian gifts, national milestones, symbols of progress. In many places, dams became the first image of development children saw in textbooks. Criticizing dams is perceived as criticizing progress itself. And then, of course, they elevated engineers into godlike status. Hydraulical engineering was treated as infallible. Media portrayed engineers as brilliant problem solvers who could tame nature. Criticizing dams feels to many like criticizing science, rationality, or national achievement. And here's how it really got sunk. Those churches reinforced the myth. Churches endorsed dams as a form of divine dominion over nature. This tied dams to religious identity, making them sacred objects in the collective imagination. Dam construction became a moral good. Criticizing dams became an act of sacrilege. Those churches, you could always rely on them. I did a little looking into it, of the nonprofits that get all the tax benefits. Who do you think is the number one? Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Who do you think is number one? Universities, churches, hospitals. Well, if you guessed churches as number one, you would be correct. You'd get the prize. Churches are the number one benefit from tax benefits. Churches, yes, you heard me, churches. Anyway, so then, of course, along comes Hollywood. Films, documentaries, and magazines portray dams as colossal triumphs, moral achievements, symbols of unity, icons of the American spirit. The Hoover Dam became a cultural shrine. This imagery was exported globally. Yeah, you're all going to die because the United States cooked up the dams. Don't ever forget that part when water is flowing through your house and your basement. Don't ever forget where the root of evil is heading their ugly head out of. Always look for the root of things so you're always clear about who caused these disasters, right? So it becomes psychological self defense. Accepting that dams are disastrous forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. Governments failed. Experts misled us. Institutions all lied. Progress was not progress. Collapse is human made. Most people choose denial over cognitive upheaval. So dams became a symbol of stability. Massive structures created the illusion that someone is managing the world. Criticizing dams removes the psychological safety net. People react emotionally. In Iran, they now have 600 plus dams. They have collapsing rivers. They have shrinking aquifers. They have desertification. They have catastrophic floods. Yet the public clings to the narrative that, hey, nobody knew, right? Admitting the truth threatens national identity and institutional trust. When people defend dams, they are not defending concrete. They are defending the myth that someone has nature under control. The Bible does not describe flooding as punishment. It describes them as consequences of imbalance. Churches simplified that into fear, and governments use that fear to protect their own mistakes. This is according to how I think it happened, but you'll have to think for yourself. A flood reveals what a society tried to hide. In ancient texts and in modern Iran, water exposed the truth. So after World War II, the U.S., you heard me right, the USA launched a global modernization campaign. From 1945 through the 1970s, American engineers, planners, and development agencies aggressively promoted the idea that dams equals modernization. This was not ideological, it was strategic. And the root motives export the Tennessee Valley Authority or the TVA model to developing regions, counter Soviet influence with infrastructure aid, transform rural societies into stable, compliant states, expand American engineering, construction, and hydropower companies. All about the money. Cha-ching, cha-ching. Control regional water flows as strategic leverage. So USAID, the World Bank, and the Bureau of Reclamation all became tools in this global dam building machine. And Iran, unfortunately, became one of the biggest Cold War dam targets. After the US and UK, good morning, London, installed the Shah in 1953. So, yes, the US and UK installed the Shah in 1953. And then Iran became a showcase for American led modernization. So, what happened next? Well, you hear that money starting to ring? The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation engineers were brought in. Hydropower and irrigation projects were fast tracked. American consulting firms designed all of the major dams. The Shah was sold the idea that industrial modernity required giant dams, monocrop agriculture, urban migration, centralized water control, just about everything the people really didn't need, right? That Shaw, what a guy, what a guy. His son is now trying to take over the country. I hope you have some brains about you and stop that, but I'll keep reading here. So between the 1950s and the late 1970s, Iran built or planned over 600 dams, more per capita than almost anywhere else on the earth. These designs created over allocation, meaning the water was already promised to cities and farmers as if climate would never change. That system is still in place today. So the U.S. wasn't doing this only to Iran. The 1945 to 1980 dam wave was global. The same pattern happened in Iraq. The U.S. supported the Dukhan and blah, blah, blah dam. In Egypt, I've talked about this one, the High Aswan Dam, engineered first by U.S. firms, later built with Soviet support. I think that was a dam that they went through 8 or 7 engineering firms. They all said it couldn't be done. And then finally they found somebody who said it could be done. Well, that thing's going to blow off the mat in a minute now. So Afghanistan, Pakistan, they became massive irrigation modernization plans. Latin America, they copied the Grand Coulee copies. Southeast Asia, Mekong modernization plans pushed by U.S. engineers. You started to get the idea that U.S. was 100% undoubtedly the root cause of this entire deal. That's why I'm always saying, look at the root cause. Stop working in the middle. Get back to how it all got started. Then you have a different position to build on. So, if it was a Cold War contest, Soviets built socialist dams, America built capitalist dams. Both sides exported the same giant infrastructure. Isn't it funny how they both worked it out, right? Well, that's how it works when you always work together, right? The Soviets and the U.S. Hey, they're our enemy. Of course they're not. Why would you give your enemy all these things? But anyways, so the problem was baked in from the start. These dams shared the same structural flaws. Designers assumed consistent snowpack, predictable precipitation, and stable watersheds. None of that remained true. Reservoirs everywhere have lost 30 to 60% of storage capacity because damming engineers assumed that they would fix it later. Dams encourage water-intensive agriculture, which forced farmers to overpump aquifers when reservoirs fell. And that is exactly what's happening in Iran right now. If the climate or population changed, the system failed because dams cannot adapt. So, why the media now acts shocked? Well, journalists often treat water shortages as unexpected. Hey, who could have seen it? How did Tehran run out of water? Where are Iran's reservoirs dry? Why didn't we anticipate this crisis? But the engineering community has known since the late 1990s that the post World War II dam model was collapsing under climate shifts, sedimentation, over allocation, groundwater depletion, and urban expansion. Iran is just hitting the wall earlier and more visibly. This will be the path for everybody. If you think I'm joking, I am not joking. The crisis began ages ago, but the modern news cycle pretends that this is about drought. This is about mismanagement. This is about climate alone. But the root cause was the 1945 to 1980 American modernization doctrine that created too many dams with too high water promises in a climate sensitive region without adaptive management tied to Cold War geopolitics. Iran is now paying for decisions made under the Shah with U.S. advisors, decisions baked into the entire water allocation system today. So I'm going to skip past part of this because that clip you just heard covers a lot of that. I'm going to skip past here. Pretty much, dams were sold as a salvation, but they were about the control. And they also, don't forget, they used dams to slaughter the buffalo. They diverted water on the native Indians first to starve them so they couldn't grow crops. Then water was also diverted because one of their treaties was that they owned the land as long as the buffalo roamed. Well, no one ever thought the buffalo would start roaming. Well, thanks to the U.S. government, they brought in people and just murdered all the buffalo. So that's how they grabbed up all that land, because of dams. I think the Native American dam was the very first one they built. Because in 1902, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation was founded to make the desert bloom, and its mission was to capture rivers in the West, irrigate deserts, control settlers, and eliminate indigenous independence. So, reality, treaties were promised, tribes were promised land as long as the buffalo roamed. Then the government killed the buffalo, dammed the rivers, and starvation forced tribes into reservations. That's exactly how it happened, thanks to dams. So, the first one built during the Depression, Hoover Dam, 1931 to 1936, a national stage play. Hoover Dam was more performance than project. There was a huge PR campaign that showed men dangling on ropes, concrete pouring night and day. They added zodiac engravings and bronze eagles. Hoover looked like a temple of destiny. Newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. And then, of course, we had the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was wrapped in films. They had films called The River Valley of the Tennessee. So families shown flickering on light bulbs, children taught. Anyway, I lost track there. So anyway, so yeah, a lot of this happened because of movies. And then, of course, the coup, the Shah, 1953, the CIA and MI6 toppled. The Shah is reinstalled as Washington's lawyer partner. Yeah, they toppled the one guy, 53, just in time to bring those dams in, right? So they topple the Mossadegh, and the Shah gets reinstalled as Washington's loyal partner. The root of all your evil over there, that Shah and the United States, big buddies. So U.S. engineers and World Bank loans flow into Iran first. First, they came up with the Des Dam in 1963, literally built by Tennessee Valley Authority veterans. Then there's the Courage Dam, and others followed, promoted as symbols of progress. So, the reality, ancient underground water channels that sustained farming for centuries were destroyed. I'd call that a plan. Wetland was drained, aquifers started collapsing, farming communities are abandoned as salinity spreads. After the revolution, the Islamic Republic condemned the Shah's westernization. Yeah, a little bit too late, right? But they still kept building dams, so I don't know how confused they were over things. So today they have 600 plus dams. Most are failing, silted, or evaporating. Lake Shermia shrank to less than 5% of its former size. That's a pretty big shrink. The Zadi Rud River dried to a cracked desert. So that leaves 28 million Iranians lacking reliable water. Protests since 2018 cry, "We are thirsty." The regime answers with bullets. So, yeah, I think that we can kind of see the picture here, right? How they snuck in there and started doing all these things. I've already talked about all these other dams, that Three Gorges Dam in China. When the Three Gorges Dam in China explodes, my estimation, which I think is very low, that Three Gorges Dam is right on the Yangtze River. I think, and I think I'm being conservative. And remember, it was built on earthquake land, so it was built on very unstable land to begin with. Well, when that thing blows, it'll likely take out, I would say, over 40% of the entire population in China, easily, easily. So, yeah, so in Iran, U.S. engineers and World Bank loans built the Dez and the Karaj. The Shah called it progress, but the dams drained wetlands, destroyed farming, and today 28 million people have no water. So, yes, this is where it all got started, right? So, anyways, how'd they get so many dams? Well, they got so many dams because the U.S. and that Shah came in there. So, I don't know. For decades, dams were believed to be a tool for prosperity. With climate change and overuse, they turned into part of the problem. Today, many Iranians feel betrayed by their leaders' past choices, but the mainstream view is that this was due to mismanagement and short sighted, not a deliberate long term trick. Well, I personally see it as a long-term trick. But of course, everybody else has their own option to see it how you want to see it. So, yeah, so they planted the seeds in the 50s. The U.S. and the Shah came in there, and before you know it, they had 600 dams, is really how it worked, right? Um, the Shah fled briefly in 53 and then came back, and the CIA and then brought him back in. So, yeah, August 22nd, 1953, the Shah returned to Iran to reestablish his authority. From that point on, his rule was firmly backed by the U.S. and Britain. This close alignment opened the door for heavy Western involvement in Iran's economic development programs, including U.S. backed planning for major dams a few years after that. So the Shah did indeed leave Iran during the crisis, but he returned to power to get those dams built, right? So I think this is about all I have to say about all of this. Because let me see, I don't know what the protest is going on about now. I suspect it's about water, right? Um, but I don't speak their language and stuff. But this all got started. Let me see here. Uh, anyway, so let me put this on hold for a second here and see if I can wrap this up. Oh, and I did check, and no mainstream historian or scientist describes the continuity as a eugenics program or a conspiracy. That's just coming from me. So nobody has written in history or any official books or any universities that considers this a eugenics ploy. Yeah, I'm 100% on the eugenics thing on this thing. This was this was so done on purpose that it's really hard to call it anything else, right? That Three Gorges Dam, geographically complex area with known landslide prone slopes. Yeah, there's a lot to these dams that are going to be rising up soon. Um, So let the record show that I stand alone against the scientists on this issue, that I think 100% this is all about eugenics. Many large dam projects, particularly in the US, Canada, China, India, and elsewhere, displaced indigenous people and other rural communities. Yes, a lot of poor people get shifted around. So when these dams blow over the top, the first person, people or persons or people that get killed are those poor indigenous people because They kicked them off the land to build the dam. Well, you're a poor indigenous person. How far do you think you're going to move? You're going to move right next to where they're doing the dam, right? So when you move next to where they're building the dam and the dam blows out, well, the indigenous people, unfortunately, are the first ones to get wiped off of the map. So how it always happens, right? Those with little cause. Uh, so the root cause of the damn problem, technologically development model, they saw it as proof. They didn't think about all the stuff coming down the road. So I'm going to put this on hold for a second. I got to close out this file. Well, I don't have a whole lot more to say here. I've done several shows about dams. I've covered the Egypt Dam, I've covered the Three Gorges Dam. If you go to my website, I have a section called Top Pods, and all of those shows are listed over there. Anything you want to find out about dams, I likely have already talked about it. But let me close you with this thought. History has taught us something brutal. You don't need bullets to break a people. You just need to choke their rivers, poison their fields, and then call it progress. Be safe out there and goodbye for now.